spirit and in truth. To partake of the Lord's Supper and remember our Savior who died on the cross for us. Father, help us as we go through life that you're always in our forefront, that we will always be about doing your will. Bless Jamie as he conducts the class. Things he says is we'll take them and we'll study them and be better Christians in the future than we've been in the past. Hallowed be thy great and mighty name. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
All right, so today we're beginning a new study for the next 13 weeks, next quarter, or this quarter. And the idea or the title is kind of The Bible in World History, or Set in World History. And to be honest with you, as I began preparing this class, and I'm still preparing this class, I found a lot of difficulty because as I start reading various things about world events, I find something that's interesting and I get off on a tangent reading that, and then I find something else and that takes me elsewhere that's really not so much related to the class, but so it's been kind of a struggle, but I think it's going to be an interesting study. And let me start by pointing out or making about a website that I found. And it was just the introductory page. I didn't go into the whole thing, obviously, because you got to buy these books and all that, and I didn't want to do it. But it was actually a woman who was preparing history lessons for homeschooling with a Bible perspective. But what I found interesting in her first page, and what I wanted to start the class with, was her thought, and I've actually probably had this thought myself, was that you have your kids sit in Bible class. And as they're learning the Bible, they're learning this timeline of history related to the Bible. But then they go to school, and there they get another timeline that deals with world history. And if you start to compare them, you see things don't match up very much. And so I can imagine that could be somewhat confusing for children as it would be for adults. And so what do we do about that? How do we handle that type of thing? And so I want to just spend a little bit here at the beginning talking about the difference between the biblical timeline and the secular world timeline. And how do we try to harmonize those things? Well, there's some things that we need to understand. First of all, we need to note that the Bible is not a history book. Now, it's got a historical narrative, factual historical narratives. Talks about people that existed, talks about events that had happened, talks about places that existed at the time and still exist today with the same names and all. And so we look at the Bible from this standpoint that it is not a history book, but it contains history. We also need to understand that the focus on the events within the Bible are leading to one conclusion, and that is the coming of the Messiah. So it's not one of these books that you go through and say, hey, what's happening over here? What's happening over here? It's focused on one theme, okay? Beginning with, with the creation, but beginning really with Abraham. It's all focused on this one nation. And again, with the idea leading to the coming of the Messiah and the redemption of mankind. So as we look at the Bible and we start looking at timelines and we start looking at history, we got to keep in mind that it's a very narrow focus. We also find that the details of mankind's development and historical events is very limited, if not totally absent in the Bible. And for certain people, me for example, that can be very frustrating. We read about events and all it does is it says this happened. Doesn't tell us how it happened, didn't necessarily tell us why it happened many times. You want to know of a particular person, well, what was their life like? What else was it? Well, it just mentions the person and maybe one particular event that they were involved in. It doesn't give us all the details, perhaps, that we would like to have. Someone once said, the Bible doesn't cater to man's curiosity. And so as we're reading this, we become curious about this, but the Bible's not going to tell us those things, again, because that's not the focus. The focus is not to give us all the details and all the history of the events that we see or would like to have. For example, we're going to talk about next week, we're going to be talking about Abraham in the city of Ur. Well, what did he do there? What was his life like there? Those things we don't know. The Bible just simply does not tell us. We will look to see what the civilization of the Sumerians was. That's what part of our focus for next week. But again, those details are not there. Secular civilizations such as the Sumerians, Egypt, Assyria, any others that we find that are mentioned in the Bible, really are only discussed when they interact with God's people or have some part in God's plan. And so, again, we're trying to, if we want to know more about these particular civilizations or peoples, we've got to go to other sources to find out more about them. All the Bible is going to tell us is, again, how does this interact, or how do they interact in terms of God's plan of bringing the Redeemer into the world? And as I've always said, I'll say this in every class or as we start, if you got a comment or question, you want to add something, please feel free to do so. Secular history, on the other hand, its focus is on civilizations and nations, the activities of mankind in a secular environment. Okay? And from their viewpoint, things that are the events recorded in the Bible and the peoples recorded in the Bible are pretty much insignificant in those terms. You know, not until you really get to perhaps maybe the reign of David and Solomon, do you see that the nation of Israel really had any influence, and even then it was on a very limited and localized nature. And then once the nation breaks apart, really the only thing that you read about them is how they're being destroyed by other peoples for the most part, and how they are dealing internally. So again, you're trying to match these two up, but you got to recognize that there are different objectives involved in these historical narratives that we read about. So when we begin to look at, we're trying to put these things together, trying to establish a common timeline is often difficult due to the assumptions that each of these, and I'm going to use the term worldview, has. You have the biblical worldview. And what that says is that man's history begins with the creation. All dates from creation to today fall within a limited space of time, roughly 6,000 to 10,000 years, based on whose chronology you're going to look at. The cultural and technological advances was not a prolonged process for man. God created man with the ability to live and thrive in the world. Let's look at a passage, Genesis chapter 4, verse 20. Genesis chapter 4 and verse 20. This is before the flood, as the population of mankind is growing. And we read this in verse 4, beginning in verse 20. Adad bore Jabal. He was the father of those who dwell in tents and have livestock. His brother's name was Jubal. He was the father of all those who play the lyre and the pipe. Zillah also bore Zubal-Cain. He was the forger of all instruments of bronze and iron. And what we see here is that very much in man's history, they already had the intelligence to deal and interact with their environment and thrive in that environment. So that communication was already there. They could speak to one another. God was able to speak to certain individuals because there was a language that existed at that point. So that, again, as we look at the Bible, we're looking at a very limited time scope so that the events that we're going to talk about perhaps happened a lot quicker and a lot sooner than what the secular historian is going to tell us that. So let's talk about the assumptions and the views of the secular worldview. First of all, they're going to say the world is billions of years old, not just 6,000 to 10,000 years old, but billions of years old. And it's the environment and everything developed over time. And we're familiar with, I think, again, the whole evolution idea and the secular idea that, for many, that the world is eternal, matter is eternal. And it just takes a long time for things to develop. In fact, they will say that man's presence in the world, actually relative to the time that the world existed, is relatively short, maybe 200 to 400,000 years old. That man is very recent in this whole development of the world here. They will also say that man's intellectual development was very slow. I mean, we've all read about the caveman and, discovers fire and all these kind of things, and it takes a long, long time for things to develop. And they will say then that cultural and technological advances began very slowly, and man's intellect developed very slowly over time until they could reach the point that they could make the pyramids and all those kind of things, where the Bible would say, no, they had the intellectual capacity, and they developed the technology on a rather quick scale here. The knowledge of ancient history is based on archaeology and anthropology. That is the idea that we obviously don't have the written records. We're going to come back to that in a little bit later in this lesson. And so they go out and they start doing their diggings, and eventually man got to the point where they could make monuments, and they could put these pictures up there that represent some event or something in their society. So that then, before that though, they didn't have the capability of recording their history and recording their events. We'll talk about prehistory here in just a little bit in terms of the flood. But the point being then, and even then, you look at different societies, okay, different civilizations, and let's take Egypt for example. Egypt, when they were able to record their history and record the events of their civilization, they weren't concerned about, well, we need to also keep track of what Babylon's doing, or we need to see what Assyria's doing, or we need to see, what is Persia doing at this time? We need to record that. No, they were concerned with their own civilization. They were concerned about, and even not everything within their civilization. Mainly it was who was the pharaoh, or who was the king, who was the leader. Any mighty deed that he did, we might make note of that. And what's interesting, even in that regard, is that when you read of these ancient civilizations and they record these great events, they always record their successes. They don't record the defeats that they suffered. Okay? So that's one thing that's kind of unique about the Bible. The Bible says not only here's the success, but here's the great failures that we incurred. So that as you read about the Assyrians, or you read about the Sumerians, you read about the Egyptians, whoever, you're getting their perspective for their own civilization. And with that also, they didn't always keep dates. And in fact, they didn't keep dates. Again, they would say, during this monarch's time or this king's time, here's what happened. Okay? If in the next king that came along, nothing happened, they didn't record anything about him. Okay? So there are some limits. There are some things that make it very difficult, even from a secular standpoint, to get an accurate timeline. Scott.
Not only did they not report the successors, that if they didn't like the previous ruler or whatever, they destroyed history as well. They would just wipe it out.
And that's very true. They would wipe it. I was reading one example is even where Persia was fighting against Egypt, and I think at this point Persia was successful. They wiped out Egypt's history. So there are a lot of gaps, and so it is up to the archaeologists and to the anthropologists and all these individuals to try to fill those gaps. It's been found in some cases they kind of made it up. Hey, we got a gap between this ruler and this ruler. Well, who was in between? They found that someone, we'll just make a name up. Okay? Or they find, for example, they'll mention two rulers and separate them when actually they were co-rulers. They maybe ruled at different areas within the civilization. And so it really kind of messes things up, but that's their job, is to try to figure all that out. The point being then is that not only in a biblical sense, but also in a secular sense, there's a lot of interpretation. Okay? Especially, if you go through and you read about some of these archaeological sites that they're digging through, and you'll have different archaeologists who disagree as to the time frame that this particular site represents, or what peoples this site may represent. There's still a lot of interpretation. And so the whole point that we're just trying to make here is that when we try to harmonize biblical timeline with the world or secular timeline, yes, we're going to find discrepancies. We're going to find things that just don't match up. And it makes it difficult for us at times. Now, obviously, we're going to follow the biblical timeline. I think that, in fact, even several secular writers have also said, you know what, when we look at the Bible, it's a lot more accurate than we think it is. And so, obviously, that's what we're going to follow, because hopefully we all have this worldview that God created the world at a particular point, not millions of years ago or billions of years ago, but thousands of years ago, and that God had a hand in the development and spread of mankind. Thought or comments? Jay.
I like to imagine that God is the master craftsman, and we have a new thing today where you try to make it antiquing, where you try to make something that's brand new look as if it were old, because that's what people want to see.
Right.
Something that's old is built with quality,
Right.
it was built well. So we try to make something new look old, and if God's the master craftsman, then he could obviously have made an earth that would appear to everyone to be billions of years old, have all the evidence necessary, the patina that proves that it is this old.
Well,
But obviously, we know all powerful God could do that.
right. And the only thing I would say to that is that I don't think God would try to trick us into thinking it's older than it really is. Some people have made that argument. Well, God made it look old so that for whatever reason. Well, God didn't do that, but I think, again, that things developed a lot quicker than the secular archaeologists and secular historians want to accept. And we'll see some of that more as we get into it. Scott, and then Rita.
He was saying, if you look at how we date things, one of them is radiocarbon 13, which relies on constant temperature, constant
Right.
pressure, constant time, and that's not accurate.
Right.
I mean, they've got proof in Mount St. Helens, we got
Right.
rocks that have been extreme heat, and now they look like they're millions of years old, trees like 200 years old.
Right. Yeah. And really not going to get into all that. I mean, it's a good point to make that even, and this is why I went back, or why I said, even from a secular standpoint, there's a lot of interpretation and assumptions being made. Rita, you had your hand.
Well, going back to the timeline, just think what a tornado can do.
Right.
Just a few minutes. And a snowstorm, a fire, and things burn up really, really, really quickly. However, it hasn't been that long since the California fire in Paradise, and it's already starting to bring that up.
Oh, yeah.
So
Yeah.
it can happen very quickly.
Well, and just think in terms of what how the flood changed the world. And where many people say, well, here's evidence of a long period of time, when actually it was a cataclysmic event that did it. But we can get into the flood stuff, really not the point of this. But I do want to relate to the flood as we continue on. If you will, turn in your Bibles to Genesis chapter 10. Genesis chapter 10. In Genesis chapter 10 and 11, we have what I believe is, for the most part, the recreation of man and a restart of mankind. And it wasn't until I started doing this study that I really began to appreciate Genesis chapter 10. Genesis chapter 10, some call it the Table of Nations, but it is the descendants of Noah and his sons as they now begin to repopulate the earth. And what Genesis chapter 10 is kind of a summary, if you will, that gives us a brief summary of what's going to happen, or setting the conditions, or what's the word I want to use here? Setting the stage of what we're going to see happen in later years. Then you get to chapter 11. Here you have the Tower of Babel, and tells why chapter 10 is the way that it is, and that is the spreading of the nations through the changing of the languages. But anyway, as I look at Genesis chapter 10, and again, as I began doing some study and look at this, I became more fascinated with it. Okay, we're always, before you just kind of skip over genealogies, but there's a lot in this that I think is important to us. So in Genesis chapter 10, we have, again, Noah and his sons and their descendants as they begin to populate the earth. And I just want to notice a few verses in this, just to show some details that we find here. Look, beginning in verse 2, it says, the sons of Jephthah, Gomer, Magog, Mediah, Javan, Tubal, Meshach, and Tyrus, and we won't go into all of those. But what's interesting here is we look at some of these names. Well, actually, let's go down to verse 5 before we make our point. He says, from these the coastland people spread in their lands, each with his own language, by their clans in their nations. Colin Dalich, in their commentary, points out that when he talks about the coastland lands, he's talking about the upper Mediterranean coastline and basically Europe over into what we would call India, or the Indo-European peoples here. So what we're seeing here, and actually let me go ahead and put this up. I wish I could make this bigger, but it's the biggest one I could find here. What you have here is a distribution on the map that shows where the various descendants of the three sons came about. For example, we're talking about Japheth. So if you look at the red, or I guess that's kind of red portion, this is where his descendants began to spread. And as you read through these names, you kind of see this. For example, I didn't know until this study, we see the name there in verse 2 of Javan. That's the Hebrew word for Greece, or for Ionia. We see the word Mediah. That name was found on an Assyrian monument referring to the Medes, which are also related to the Persians. Notice on here, down in verse 4, he speaks of Tarshish. Okay, where's Tarshish? If you're familiar with Tarshish, it is over here in Spain. Okay, so you're seeing these people spread out into this area. And again, here's where we don't know the details. How did they get there? How long did it take them to get from the land of Shinar, where the Tower of Babel was, up to these lands? Okay, so we go down to chapter 10 and verse 6. The sons of Ham, Cush. If you have somebody have the King James Version or New King James? What is the name after Cush? Mizraim. Okay. If you look at the English Standard Version, that's Egypt. Okay. Cush is Ethiopia. And so we look at the descendants of Ham down here. They pretty much northern Egypt, or what we call northern Africa, rather. You do see some overlap here. You see the Heth up here. Heth is thought to be the Hittites. And all the way down into the Arabian Peninsula, we see them here. And then finally, we find from them, let me make sure my notes here. Oh, we also find here is Nimrod. Nimrod, who many believe was the one who instigated over here, is the one who instigated the Tower of Babel. We find that not only did he build Babel or establish Babel, but also Nineveh, which would be the Assyrians. Okay, so the point is that we're finding these people spread out all over the place. Interestingly enough, going down into verses 15 through 19, Canaan fathered Sidon, his firstborn, and Heth, and the Jebusites, the Amorites, the Girgashites, the Hittites. Do we recognize these names? Who did Joshua have to fight? He had to fight all these people. They were the ones that filled the land of Canaan. if you go back into chapter 9, you find as a result of Ham's looking at Noah when he was naked and his response to that, Canaan is cursed. There's a lot of theories as to what's actually happening here, but it may just be prophetic to saying that, all these people in Canaan that he just mentions here, they're going to be subservient to Israel at some point, perhaps to other parts of the world as well. So again, we're looking at this and we're seeing that what's in this chapter has a great significance as we start to look at the world in a broader perspective. Down in verse 21, chapter 10 and verse 21, here we find the descendants of Shem. To Shem also, the father of all the children of Eber, the elder brother of Japheth, children were born. And he goes through and he lists those about Shem here. But what's interesting again in this, looking down at verse 25, excuse me, to Eber was born 2 sons. The name of one was Peleg, for in his days the earth was divided. Well, what's he referring here to? Well, I think he's referring to the Tower of Babel, when due to the confusion of the languages, then everybody started leaving. They started going off into these other areas. So again, a lot of things that we find in this particular chapter, in this genealogy, have a great bearing on what we're going to see through the rest of the Bible. Because a lot of the individuals or tribes that are mentioned here, Israel's going to have to deal with as they go throughout their history. And so it's a good way to look at that. Any thoughts or questions about chapter 10?
I have a question. So I guess this is kind of a summary, like before we get into the details.
Yes.
of the Bible. So they mentioned language in verse 5.
Right.
According to this language.
Right. Yeah, in fact, some have criticized that. So, we got a contradiction here. But you think about Genesis chapter 1. Genesis chapter 1 gives you an overview of the creation week. You get to chapter 2, now you're focused on the creation of man, right? Kind of same thing here. You're given this overview or this summary. Now we're going to go look at some of the details, okay? And that to me makes perfect sense. We're going to tell you how everything's spread out. How did we get there? Well, now we're going to tell you those details, and we go into the story of the Tower of Babel. What's interesting, if you go down in chapter 11, let's see, make sure I'm in the right spot. In chapter 11, beginning in verse 10, here we find the descendants of Shem, and it starts giving ages here. And if you sit there and you play this out, what you find out is when Peleg then is, Peleg, however you pronounce it, when he comes about, we're looking at the Tower of Babel. The incident there occurred 100 to 200 years after the flood. It didn't take long for the population to grow enough and for their development to build this tower to come along that now we have this within 100 to 200 years here. And if you continue on going on, what you're going to find as you read there is that Noah was still alive when Abraham was born. Okay? I never really thought about that before. Well, I've heard it before, but just never really gave it much thought. So how do we hear some of these stories that we see? Because those who experienced it are going to relate it to their descendants, and we'll talk about that here next. So they are separated if we read about the Tower of Babel, and we know the story that God confused the languages because they were in rebellion to him. In fact, the whole idea of the name Nimrod means we will rebel. We think of him being this mighty warrior or this mighty hunter, but he was not a good guy. And we could go on again to a whole new lesson on Nimrod himself. But he was leading the people in rebellion to God because they did not spread across the earth like God wanted them to. So it confuses the languages here. But keep in mind that when he confuses the language and they begin to separate, it's not just languages that they take with them, but they take perhaps a limited amount of the technologies. So that maybe you find one civilization is a little bit more proficient in their technologies in certain ways than another might be. They also took their genetics with them. as you have these different families now becoming more isolated, those things that are individual to that genetic line follow along with them. And I'm sure all of us have been this way. Have you ever had somebody come into a room that you don't know, but you immediately know what family they are? Why? Because they have those physical characteristics that relate to that family. So why do you have the Asian people that look the way they do? Why do you have maybe those in Africa who look the way they do, or those up in Northern Europeans? They have a particular look, because eventually those genetic propensities or genetic ideas became isolated as they moved off into different lands. Any thought or comment? Okay, in the time that we have left, as we're talking about history, and we talk about the development of things, we talk about recording history, obviously that's time, and what we're talking about now, the Tower of Babel, we're talking about the flood, is in that period we call prehistory. We don't have any eyewitness accounts. We don't have any written records by those who were on the scene to tell us what happened. Well, how do we find out about those things? Well, through one generation passing down the stories to the next generation. Sure, Adam and his sons began to tell their descendants, hey, we came through this great flood and everything started all over. Let me tell you about it. Okay, as they then have their own children, hey, we're going to tell you what happened to grandfather and great-grandfather, and they start telling those stories. And then as we have these languages split, each takes those stories with them. And obviously, over time, things are going to get modified, right? You ever played the telephone game? That's what we used to call it. You get a group of people, you tell one person, give them a sentence. You tell it to them once. Excuse me. They then have to whisper in the ear to the person next to them that sentence, okay? And they can only do it once. Then that person tells it to the next person. And if you have enough people, by the time you get to the end, you have that person at the end say, okay, what was the sentence? It's totally different than what you started with. Well, this is what happens with oral history over time. People will not only modify it, maybe based on memory, but they also are going to try to make this fit within the culture that's developed, maybe referencing their gods in terms of the one God. Now, here's the gods that we look at. We're going to make this story fit. What we're talking about here, and particularly in relation to the flood of Noah, is what many call the flood legends. And what's interesting is that there are over 200 flood languages, some say as many as 500, from around the world that speak of a great flood that in many ways parallels the biblical account. That have certain similarities. And I mean, again, we talk about all over the world. I'm going to read some things. There's a good article on apologeticspress.org. If you're not familiar with that website, I would encourage you to look at this quite often. They do a lot of good evidence stuff and other things. But they have an article called The Legends of the Flood. And you can look it up online. I'll give you the address, or if you want a copy, we can make a copy of the article here. But what they go through and show gives us several examples of the different flood legends from out the world. For example, they talk about the Aztecs, okay? That Indian tribe here in our nation, or in our country, says the Aztecs tell of a worldwide global flood in a story with striking parallels to the biblical deluge. Only two people, the hero Kaz and his wife, survived the flood by floating in a boat that came to rest on a mountain. Then soon after the flood, giants constructed a great pyramid and endeavored to reach the clouds. Such ambition is said to have angered the gods, who scattered the giants with fire sent from the heavens. And then also lists some other of our Native American tribes that have very much similar ideas here. The ancient Greeks had one, a man by the name of Deucalion. Zeus, the god, was determined to destroy mankind, but Deucalion and his wife were forewarned of this impending disaster. They were placed in a large wooden chest by one of the immortals named Prometheus. For 9 days and nights, the floodwaters covered almost all of the earth. Only a few mountain peaks remained, and then from them, the earth was populated again. In this case, I think they're like when Deucalion threw a rock behind him, it became a man. When his wife threw a rock behind her, it became a woman. So again, you see things have changed as time went on, but a very similar story. One of the most fascinating to me is you look at the Chinese language, okay, and some of y'all may have already seen this. Here is on the left the symbols for large boat. If you break the symbols down, it is boat, the number 8, and a mouth are persons. What's that telling you? Where did they get that idea? Well, wow. Noah and his sons and wives and sons and their wives, 8 of them, were put on a large boat. Okay? In fact, apparently there are a number of symbols in the Chinese language that relate to many things within the Bible. Where did they get this idea? Well, somewhere, as things have been passed down to them, we find all these things about there was this great flood that happened many years ago, again, changed over time, but tells us that, yes, there probably was this event that took place. In Babylon, there is the Gilgamesh epic, or the Epic of Gilgamesh. Basically, you had a man, some think this is actually a reference to Nimrod himself, who wanted to be immortal. And so he went to one of the gods. That god said, and he went to ask him, how did you become immortal? And he said, well, the gods instructed this individual to build a boat because a terrible flood was coming. He built the boat, covered it with pitch, put animals of all kinds on it, as well as certain provisions. After he entered the boat with his family, it rained for 6 days and nights. When the flood ended, the boat rested on a Mount Nezer. After 7 days, he sent out a dove to see if the waters had receded. The dove came back, so he sent out a swallow. It also came back. He sent out a raven, and it never returned, so he knew it was time that they could get out of this big boat or this ark. And we don't have time to go through all of these. Again, if you want a copy of this, I will share it with you and we could go make copies of it. But I just find it fascinating that all of these flood myths in some way talk about things very similar to what we read in the Bible. And again, the question is raised, where did they get this idea? Where did it come about? And in fact, one individual in this article, he makes reference to it, one man who actually was an evolutionary geologist. And he made this statement: narratives of a massive inundation are found all over the world. Stories of a great deluge are found on every inhabited continent and among a great many different languages and cultural groups. So then, that what another writer then makes this point, who did a great survey of all this, and let's read through this. In 95% or more of the 200 flood legends, the flood was worldwide. In 88%, a certain family was favored. In 70%, survival was by means of a boat. In 67%, animals were also saved. In 66%, the flood was due to the wickedness of man. In 66%, the survivors had been pre-warned. In 57%, they all ended up on a mountain. In 35%, birds were sent out from the boat. And in 9%, exactly 8 people were spared. That's amazing that you have all this from all over the world talking about this one event. So it tells us then, it shows us how history can be recorded, but it also, I think, in this illustrates how things change in that narrative over time. So it's why it's sometimes difficult to go back to look at prehistory and get a confident understanding of what actually happened. Got just a few minutes. I want to share one more with you. We're actually through with that. But another interesting story that I read, and again, this is on apologeticspress.org. Back from 1392 to 1897, you had the chosen nation, which was in Korea, was the dynastic power from those time periods. In fact, Korea was much a mystery to Europeans in the 17th century. Well, this kind of changed when a Dutch ship in 1653 shipwrecked on an island right off the coast of South Korea. And the crew was taken captive, and they were taken to the capital, which was Seoul, and they remained in captivity for 12 years. In 1666, 8 of those survivors were able to escape to Japan. One of those survivors, Hendrik Hamel, wrote of the Korean society and its cultures. And one of the things he noticed about their religious life, which was Confucianism, or they followed Confucius, he wrote concerning their monks, and they had this belief. Many monks believed that long ago all people spoke the same language. But when people built a tower in order to climb into heaven, the whole world was changed. We have the Tower of Babel, being understood by this group that's basically been isolated for centuries from the rest of the world. Well, where did they get that idea? Because this is what happened. And they carried that down through their generation to generation. And again, with modifications being made, but when you put it all together, they all tell the same story. And I just used, again, that as an example to show that when we start looking at the Bible, we're looking at true events. We're looking at things that really happened. And even though we may not have the written record, we do have indications that, yes, these things are true. But then, as we're going to see next week, we start finding the development of writing, the development of keeping records, and we're going to see, again, what's going on in the world as Israel is going through its periods, different periods of history as well. Any thought or comment? Steve?
How this is pre-internet, and these things that you're mentioning, we've known about for a long time. It wasn't just since the internet came along that we finally were able to share this information.
Right. Oh, exactly. Yeah, one of the other interesting things I found on the internet, and again well, actually it wasn't on Apologetics Press. It was another website. It was talking about how historians many times write years, perhaps centuries after particular events take place. One of them was a man who was commissioned by Ptolemy in Egypt to write, he was a priest, he was commissioned to write a history of Egypt. And so he has this long list of the various pharaohs or kings, leaders through that. And while many people say, well, yeah, he's pretty accurate because he had a lot of resources to work with, there are others who question, and we talked about earlier about there may be gaps, and some say he kind of made things up and filled in these gaps. But one of the individuals who was most critical of him was Sir Isaac Newton. In fact, he wrote a book saying, here's the mistakes he made, and instead of having these hundreds of emperors or pharaohs, he said, actually, we can narrow this down to a very small number that, again, would then fit within the biblical chronology, which I thought that was fascinating in itself. Now, I don't know how much credence we can give to Sir Isaac Newton, but the point is, people recognize, that even in secular history, there are some things that we have to overcome because we just don't know the accuracy of it. All right, anything else before we close? All right, we're just about done, so we'll go ahead and finish here. Again, if you want a copy of this article, we can go back and make one, or just look at it on apologetics.org and read about it. All right, thank you for your time.